After a terrible date, the waitress smiled. "If you want, I'll sit in your booth all night." Before we begin the story, don't forget to subscribe and follow Tender Bonds. Like and share our story. Silas drove home from Findlay on the interstate with the heater running full, and still the cold came through the door seals. That particular January cold that had nothing provisional about it. That meant business the way only Ohio cold did, sitting on the chest, making the lungs work for it. The date had been at a steakhouse in a strip mall between a nail salon and a mattress store. And the woman, Carol from the app, a dental hygienist with kind eyes in her profile photo, had looked at him across the basket of rolls and said, "I can tell you're a good person," which was the kindest possible way of saying she would not be calling again. He'd driven her back to her Kia and watched her taillights disappear, and sat in the parking lot for 11 minutes listening to a country station play 3 songs he did not know before pulling out onto Route 15. The Rusty Nail was the only thing open between Findlay and Delphos at that hour, a diner that had been a bar before the owner's wife had a conversion experience and removed the liquor license. So it kept the name for obscure sentimental reasons and served coffee and eggs and pie at all hours to truckers and insomniacs and men driving home from mediocre evenings. Silas pulled in because the gas gauge was low and the place was lit up like a promise. He took a booth by the window. Outside, the highway was a long gray seam across the dark. In the truck bed, visible from where he sat, a blue tarp shifted in the wind and went still. He looked at it for a moment and then looked away. The waitress who came was named Cass. Her tag said so, the letters stamped into a plastic pin that had gone slightly crooked. She was maybe 34, 35, dark-haired, with the particular economy of movement that belongs to people who have been on their feet since 4 in the afternoon and have learned not to waste anything. She set down the laminated menu and looked at him in one quick appraisal that was entirely without judgment. The good suit that meant occasion, the loosened tie, the expression of a man who has recently been let down very gently. She said coffee. He said yes. She poured it and started to turn and then didn't. She said rough night. He said first date. She said ah. Then after a beat that contained a great deal, "If you want, I'll sit in your booth all night." He looked up then. She wasn't flirting, or not only flirting, or not in the way that required anything from him. It was simpler than that. It was the offer of a warm room and a person across the table, which is not nothing. He said, "I'd like that." She came back 20 minutes later when the counter had quieted, and Gordy, the manager, had retreated to the back with a glass of water. She slid into the booth across from him with her own mug, and the ease of a woman who has stopped requiring permission for small things. Outside, the wind lifted the corner of the tarp in the truck bed and let it drop. They talked the way strangers do when both are tired enough for honesty, without pressure, at an angle to the things that mattered. She told him she'd come from Dayton after a divorce she called clarifying, the way a forest fire is clarifying. He told her about the warehouse outside Elida, 12 employees, lumber and fasteners and drywall, the invisible infrastructure of other people's construction. She said, "You live alone." He said he did. She said, "You strike me as someone who's made a whole philosophy out of it." He said, "What does that mean?" She looked at him without apology. She said, "My ex-husband thought he was an island, thought it kept him clean. It doesn't keep you clean, it just keeps you separate." She wrapped both hands around her mug. "Everything you're protected from is also everything you don't get to have." He looked at his coffee. He said, "That's a fair read." She said, "I have a daughter." Joni ate. She placed it on the table early without ceremony, so there would be no confusion about terms. He said, "That's a good age." She looked at him to check whether he meant it. He did. Outside, a semi downshifted on the highway, and the sound came through the glass, diesel and cold air, and something in Silas's chest pulled tight and then released, the way it did whenever diesel reached him in a quiet moment. He knew the source of it and no longer tried to outmaneuver it. You learned, eventually, to let the thing move through you. Miller had driven an F-250 diesel and had been dead for a year come February. Cass said someone. He looked at her. She said, the way your face just went. He said, my best friend. He died last February. He said it the way you say a thing you've said enough times that the words have worn smooth, though the thing behind them has not. Blood clot. 41 years old. We'd known each other since we were 18. She said, I'm sorry. He nodded. She said, you heading home to anybody tonight, or just the house? He considered the question. He said, there's a woman, Deb, Miller's wife, and her daughter, Trace, she's 13. He paused. I go over Saturdays, fix things. Cass looked at him, not the look that meant how noble, which he could not stand. The other look, the one that meant she was trying to understand the shape of something. She said, how long have you been doing that? He said, since March pretty much, the month after. She said, does it help? He said, I thought it was for them. He stopped. I'm not sure anymore what it's for. What he was thinking about. What he had not told anyone because there was no one to tell it to in the particular way it needed telling, was a Wednesday morning in early November, 10 months after Miller died, when Deb had called him at 7 a.m. with a voice carrying the controlled panic of a woman who had been awake for 4 hours and exhausted her other options. The pipe under the bathroom sink had split in the night, water across the tile under the baseboard into the subfloor. She had turned off the main and mopped what she could. Her brother was in Columbus. She described the damage in a level voice that was working very hard to stay level. Silas had said, I'll be there in 20 minutes. He was there in 15. He went directly to his truck for the toolbox. A Stanley, red metal, paint rusted off one corner where Miller had dropped it backing out of a crawlspace, a fact Miller had mentioned approximately 40 times as evidence of a particular kind of bad luck, and he carried it inside and lay down on wet tile under the sink with a flashlight in his teeth. The split was a hairline failure in a copper elbow joint. He cut it out and sweated in a new fitting, and when he turned the main back on, he checked every fitting twice, the way Miller had taught him, twice before you celebrate. The water ran clear and held. He was still lying on the tile when Trace's voice came from the hallway, flat, urgent, stripped of the careful indifference she wore like a coat. Mom. He pulled himself out from under the sink. Deb was already in the hall. Trace stood in her bedroom doorway in pajamas, her face flushed to a frightening red, her eyes not quite tracking. Deb crossed to her and put her hand on the girl's forehead and said, very quietly, Jesus. The thermometer read 104.2. Deb stood holding it, and Silas watched her run the calculation parents run alone, severity against available resources, whether she was equipped for what was in front of her, and he watched the calculation come up short. Her brother in Columbus, her parents in Florida for the winter, 11 months of operating without a second person, and her daughter burning up in the doorway. She said very quietly, I don't. Silas said, I'll drive, go get dressed. He did not decide this. He would have said so later if anyone had asked, and no one did, because he was not a man who made events into stories for other people. He did not stand at a distance and calculate the cost. The world had simply moved to its next position, and he moved with it. He sat in the urgent care waiting room at midnight while Deb was in the back with Trace, sick people in heavy coats, a television running cable news at low volume. He had a magazine in his hands whose title he hadn't checked, and he was staring at a page about kitchen renovation. He thought, I should go home. She's got this from here. He did not get up. At 12:40, Deb came out with Trace wrapped in a blanket, the girl half asleep against her mother's side. And when they reached him, Deb's hands were full, her purse, the prescription bag, her keys. And without discussion, Silas took the edge of the blanket so she could sort through her keys. A simple transfer, the work of 2 seconds, the kind of thing that doesn't exist in the record of any day. It was strep, antibiotics, By Friday, Trace was eating soup. By the following Saturday, she had not mentioned that night, but when Silas arrived, she did not go to her room. She settled at the far end of the couch with her audiobook and her feet tucked under the blanket, and she turned the volume down a barely perceptible amount, a fact he registered and did not acknowledge. He had told himself then, as he had told himself from March onward, that he was doing it for Miller. He had believed this so completely and for so long that he had never thought to test it. You don't test the walls of a house you're living in. You trust them because they're holding. Cass was watching him, not impatiently. She had the quality he was noticing of a person who has learned to be still inside, not passive, still, the way deep water is still, the way it has room for things. He said, the thing about Deb and Trace is I told myself I was doing it for him, for Miller. He turned his coffee mug a quarter turn, and I never once looked at that, never asked if it was true. Cass said, is it? He looked out the window at the truck. The tarp had stilled. The cold out there was absolute. He thought about the toolbox under that tarp with the rusted corner, which had rattled on rough roads for 11 months with a low percussion he no longer heard, which he had not opened since the morning he'd sweated in a new copper fitting on wet tile, while a woman stood in a hallway running out of sentence. He said, no, I don't think it is. I think I was the one who needed. He stopped. He said, I've been alone a long time. I thought that was a preference. He looked at her. I think maybe it was just a habit I started young enough that I stopped being able to see it. Cass said Miller could see it. He looked at her sharply. She said, you said you'd known each other since you were 18, 23 years. He knew you. She wasn't gentle about it, wasn't leading him. She was simply accurate. He didn't leave you the widow and the kid. He left you the house to walk back into. Silas sat with that. The fluorescent above the counter buzzed once and settled. Outside, a single set of headlights crossed the highway westbound and disappeared. He thought about Miller, not the memory of Miller, not the image, but the tone of him, the specific atmospheric pressure of a man who filled space without meaning to, who could have an entire conversation through small sounds, whose absence had changed the air quality of every room Silas walked into for a year. He thought about Trace's audiobook turned down a barely perceptible amount. He thought about Deb's hands full at the urgent care door, and his own hands finding the edge of the blanket without being asked. He said, I have his toolbox in the truck. He nodded toward the window under that tarp. I've been hauling it around for 11 months. I used it once at Deb's and then I put it back and I haven't touched it since. He said, I keep meaning to leave it there. At her place. It'd be useful. He said, I don't. Cass said, because then you'd have to be done with it. He said, I didn't know that until right now. She looked at him steadily, nothing pitying in it. She said, that's what nights like this are for. Gordy came out of the back, refilled his water glass, assessed the parking lot, found it insufficient, and returned. The trucker at the counter finished his patty melt with focused concentration. The light above the counter buzzed and settled again into its particular silence. Cass said, can I ask you something? He said, yes. She said, the woman tonight, Carol. He said, yeah. She said, you think she was wrong about you? He thought about it honestly. He said, I think she was reading last year's version. Cass looked at him for a long moment. Then something shifted in her face, not softening exactly, something more like a door coming off its latch. She said, I have good instincts about people. He said, I'm getting that impression. She said, you don't smile a lot. He said, I've been told. She said, it looks like you're keeping it in reserve, in case it's needed. She paused. I like that actually. He looked at her the way he had not looked at another person in a very long time, without managing the distance, without installing the usual glass between himself and what was in front of him. He said, my name is Silas. She said, I know, you paid with a card, then Cass, but you knew that. He said, yeah. He left at 12:40 after leaving a tip that was more than the bill. Cass walked him to the door in the ordinary way of someone ending a conversation, not a shift, a conversation, and they stood a moment in the doorway with the cold coming hard off the parking lot. She said, "Drive safe," and he said he would, and she went back in, and he watched her shape move behind the glass until she was at the counter and had her back to him. He sat in the truck with the engine running for heat. The heater took a while in this cold. Stars very clear and very hard above the flat white fields, the sky scoured clean of everything provisional. He sat and watched the diner's light and the blue tarp over the truck bed shifting in the idle. He got out. The cold was immediate and total. He went around to the bed and lifted the tarp and undid the bungee cord and picked up the Stanley toolbox, the full dead weight of it, wrenches and sockets and the wooden-handled screwdrivers Miller had kept from his father, and he carried it to the cab and set it on the passenger seat. The rusted corner caught the light from the dashboard. A dull orange, like something that had been out in weather a long time and was only now coming in. He pulled out of the lot and onto Route 15 heading east. The highway ran straight and dark across the flat land, and the toolbox rode beside him without rattling. To the north, above the fields, the sky had gone a shade lighter near the horizon, the color not of dawn, but of the thing that comes before dawn decides to happen, a loosening in the dark, a door not yet open but no longer fully shut. He drove. The heater came up. The fields held their snow in long blue shadows under the stars, and the road went on, and the toolbox sat on the seat beside him in the warmth, still going home.